Well, welcome and Merry Christmas. On behalf of Wesley Seminary, I would like to thank you for joining us today for Effective Ministry to People Not Like You or You Don't Like from Dr. Lenny Luchetti. This event is part of the Wesley Seminary webinar series with the goal of resourcing our alumni, our students, and the local church. In fact, we were emailed, Dr. Luchetti and I, by a gentleman who is watching us live right now from Tokyo, and it's 4 a.m. local time there. So thank you all for joining us today. At Wesley Seminary, we offer a Master of Arts in Ministry with 13 specializations and a Master of Divinity with 12 specializations. Both of these can be completed 100% online in either English or Spanish. Our Doctor of Ministry program has 3 areas of concentration, as well as an individualized course of study. If you have any questions about any of these programs, we would love to answer those for you. You can call us at 877-673-0009 or email us at wesley@endwest.edu. Should you have any questions today during the webinar, please enter those questions in the Q&A forum at the bottom of the screen. I will monitor those, and Dr. Luchetti will answer as many questions as he has time after today's webinar. Dr. Lenny Luchetti is known as an insightful professor with a pastor's heart. He brings more than 25 years of ministry experience to his present role as professor of proclamation and Christian ministries at Wesley Seminary. Before joining the faculty, Lenny served as lead pastor of a small church that had a significant turnaround and grew into a large, multi-ethnic, intergenerational, economically diverse, and community impacting church into a large impacting church during his tenure. He is now primarily responsible for the development and teaching of the doctoral and master's level preaching courses at Wesley Seminary. Lenny is a popular speaker at camps, colleges, and churches. He also serves on the editorial board for Christianity Today's Preaching Today resource. Now, Dr. Luchetti has published several books, a couple of which you will have the opportunity later to complete a survey and be registered to win Preaching with Empathy, Crafting Sermons in a Callous Culture. He also has a new book that will be released this spring called Overcoming the Spiritual Slump, which I'm looking forward to reading. Dr. Luchetti has also had several articles published in Preaching Today, Christianity Today, and Ministry Matters. Dr. Luchetti received his bachelor's degree from Houghton College, his Master of Divinity degree at Asbury Theological Seminary, and his Doctor of Ministry degree at Asbury Theological Seminary. Lenny has been married to Amy, his partner in life and ministry, since 1998. They enjoy life and laughter with their teenage children, Zach, Leah, and Sam. His hobbies include fly fishing, racquetball, running, and golfing with his Wesley Seminary colleagues. He didn't know I was going to add that last part. I am honored to present to you today my friend, Dr. Lenny Luchetti.
Thanks so much, Joel, and thank you for not referring to my golf game. Appreciate that. Joel's a good golfer. I am not. Anyway, welcome to all of you. Thank you for taking time out of your busy schedule to join us as we try to get our minds around effective ministry to people not like us or people we don't like. Which may be even harder. So I'm going to run through the content, hopefully in about 35, 40 minutes. And we're going to have some Q&A, as Joel mentioned. So jot down any questions that surface in you. We're going to start with more of the theology and theory and then move in toward more practical ministry implications. So hang in there, stay with us, and we'll keep things moving. Leopard, frogs, black rhinos, and bog turtles are on the verge of extinction. So is communication. At the very least, communication is harder today than it's ever been. Now, that may seem like an odd claim, considering that we have access to advanced communication technology like the cell phone and the computer and social media such as Instagram and Facebook and Twitter. But amid our culture's political polarization and racial division, social media has, let's face it, fostered an environment in which communication is one way. monological, not dialogical. The sender sends the message to receivers, but doesn't stick around long enough to play the role of the listening receiver. So people, I think, are like advertisements today, commercials or billboards, solely sending messages, but not really receiving any. Our world is immersed in anekdoke, a conversation in which everyone is talking, but no one seems to be listening. And a communication that is one way is really not communication at all. When everyone's talking and no one is listening, which appears to be one of the potential hazards of social media, communication is lost. The only people we're tempted to listen to, let's be honest, are those who see the world as we see it. So the lack of listening is alarming. So is the lack of civility. There's a lack of civility today, you probably have noticed this, that allows us to ignore or demonize people who are not like us, politically, ethnically, economically, spiritually, and generationally. Obviously, communication breaks down when we ignore or demonize a person or group who doesn't think what we think or feel what we feel on a given topic. Ignoring, I think, comes from apathy. It's disinterest. I don't care what you think and feel. Demonizing comes from anger. It's disgust. I detest what you think and feel. Now, apathy and anger are prevalent. Just take a scroll through Facebook, and this two-headed monster threatens the extinction of communication. Dominic Basalto, writer for the Washington Post, almost 10 years ago, hit the nail on the head when he described the changes in communication. He wrote, "As a society, we are moving further and further away from messages and communication and more towards pure information delivered to whomever wants to receive it." Now, if you've been around the church for more than a week, you know that what is often happening in the culture has a way of seeping in through the pores of the church. Now, churchgoers might be a little bit nicer to people not like us or who we don't like, but not much. And unless the local church you attend is a cult, you will likely encounter people who are not like you, politically, generationally, ethnically, economically, ecclesiologically in terms of their view of church, or theologically in terms of their view of God. And I would say that congregational diversity is a sign of health. You are in a healthy church if you can look around and find quirky people not like you and perhaps who you don't like. And when we do, the temptation often when we encounter people in the church we don't like or who are not like us, the temptation is often to cut and run, go find another flock, or gather a small group of people who think and act and look just like you do. I'm going to go out and grab a bunch of 40-something Italian men who are Philadelphia Eagle fans and whose thoughts about God and the church align perfectly with mine. And I would sing with Louis Armstrong, "What a wonderful world." Actually, that would be a horrible world, since as far as I can tell, one of the greatest proofs of the presence and the power of Christ in the early church was that Jew and Gentile, different as night and day, different as the Bee Gees and the Beastie Boys, who had major ethnic, political, and religious differences, were uniting in love for each other because of their common love for Christ. And the watching world took notice. Loving and serving those not like us who we don't like has always been a hallmark of the Christian faith. Think Jesus' parable of the Good Samaritan. Jesus told this parable to Jews. And the hero of the parable is a hated half-breed Samaritan. Jews hated Samaritans. And what made the Samaritan a hero in the parable is that the Samaritan served someone not like him, a Jew who was beaten and left for dead on the road. Think about what Jesus said in the Sermon on the Mount. If you love those who love you, what reward will you have? Tax collectors do that. And if you greet only your brothers and sisters, people who are like you, what does that prove? I mean, pagans do that. Be perfect as your Father in heaven is perfect. And what does it mean for the Christian to be perfect in love? It means to love those not like you or who you don't like. And yet the church is too often known for a line in the sand exclusivity. Martin Luther King Jr. Was right when he said so long ago, it's appalling that the most segregated hour of Christian America is 11 o'clock on Sunday morning. And I would say that the segregation today is not just based on ethnicity, but generation and economics and politics, to name just a few. Enter the minister. How can we who are in Christian ministry turn the tide? How can we increase the capacity of our congregants to hospitably connect with people not like them or who they don't like? That's discipleship 101, really. The incarnation of the hospitable love of Christ in and through the Christian. I'm not after political correctness. I'm not after shallow tolerance. What I'm after is the embodiment of the gospel of Jesus Christ, whose blood makes the two one. Christian ministers have to model this, what it looks like to connect with people who are different from us. Too often, I confess, in my 25 years of ministry, I avoided people not like me instead of trying to understand them. I needed the grace of empathy, the capacity to imagine myself in someone else's situational shoes so that I think what they think and feel what they feel, so that I can see the world from their perspective. Now, on my best days in ministry, when God's grace got the better of me, I sought ways to bridge the gap of distance between me and those I served. I was a college student when I pastored my first congregation. Here I was, an educated city boy in my early 20s, pastoring a congregation of rural senior citizens, most of whom didn't even graduate high school. And I remember wrestling with, how can I communicate well with people not like me, generationally and educationally, geographically and ecclesiologically, in terms of their church preferences and traditions. I remember thinking, how in the name of Johnny Carson and Lawrence Welk can I develop the capacity to think what they think and feel what they feel, so that I can lead and care and preach in ways that connect with them, that intersect their reality without imposing my own? How can I put the gospel in a contextual container from which the people I serve can drink? Now my most difficult moments, as I mentioned, in ministry resulted from my unwillingness to actually stop, look, and listen to people not like me or who I didn't like. So instead, I would often just generalize and stereotype instead of trying to understand the nuances of people. Oh, he's an old fuddy-duddy, stuck in the past. She's a rich girl born with a silver spoon in her mouth. She doesn't care about the poor. He's a brilliant PhD who can't tie his shoes. She's a left-winger who likely doesn't believe the Bible. He's a right-winger who probably loves the Bible more than people. She's a Baptist, and well, you know how they can be. I often would stereotype people instead of trying to understand them and serve them well. Because in order to serve people well, you have to understand who they are and where they're coming from. Now, if you feel like your empathy-ometer is low, don't despair. And if you feel like you're one of those people who just sort of lack the ability to imagine yourself in someone's situational shoes so that you think what they think and feel what they feel, don't despair. There is hope for you from an unlikely tandem, neurology and theology. Let's talk first about neurology. In the 1990s, a neuroscientist named Giacomo Rizzolatti discovered mirror neurons in monkeys. You've heard of monkey see, monkey do. This is monkey see, monkey feel. Rizzolatti found that when a monkey sees another monkey perform an action, say peel a banana, the neurons in the observing monkey's brain fire as if he himself were doing the action, peeling the banana. The monkey not performing the action is empathizing with the monkey who is peeling the banana. That's why they're called mirror neurons. The observing monkey is able to mirror in his brain the feeling that the monkey who's actually doing the action experiences. So then, in time, neuroscientists also discovered that the human brain has mirror neurons too. These neurons give us the capacity to look at someone and feel what they feel in the moment they feel it. The same neurons fire whether we are experiencing something or watching someone else experience that thing. We see someone perform an action and our brain can simulate the same neural response as if we're performing and experiencing the action ourselves. So, for example, we see someone yawn and we are compelled to yawn. That's a mirror neuron. The infant who sees us smile and can't help but offer an empathetic smile back to us, that's mirror neurons. We see a boxer take a right hook to the jaw and we wince, mirror neurons. We see someone cry and we're compelled to cry. We see a spider crawling on someone's belly and we get itchy chills. That's mirror neurons that cultivate human empathy. Now, human empathy can be exploited for evil as well. The video gaming industry, which my kids tell me is not inherently evil, and also the pornography industry, banks on the human capacity to imagine our way into someone else's shoes so that we feel what they feel in the moment they feel it. But the point is, we are clearly hardwired for empathy, to in some way feel what another person feels when they feel it, just by observing them. Now, I want to shift from neurology to theology. And this quote from Marco Iacoboni, another Italian neuroscientist. I don't have a preference for Italians, although I am Italian, but they do have some good neuroscientists. So this will shift us to theology. Iacoboni writes, our brains are capable of mirroring the deepest aspects of the minds of others. Mirror neurons show the deepest way we relate to and understand each other. They demonstrate that we are wired for empathy and that morality is deeply rooted in our biology. Morality is rooted, empathy is rooted in our physiological, biological makeup. It's in us. Now, Darwin argued that humans are actually self-centered to the core, that we will do whatever it takes to survive, survival of the fittest, even if it means stepping on people, hurting people to do it. Darwinism asserts that it is in our nature to think mostly of ourselves most of the time. But fairly recent neuroscience confirms what our theology has taught us, that humans are at the core, not narcissistic, but empathetic, hardwired by God to feel and think from the perspective of another person. And since we are made in the image of God, God must be empathic too. Or is he? Does God really have the capacity to see the world from our perspective? to imagine himself in our shoes and be moved to empathically act on our behalf. There's been, believe it or not, lots of theological debate about this throughout the centuries, throughout the history of the church. Can God be moved by what moves us? And if so, wouldn't that make God weak? I mean, if God can be moved by what moves us, doesn't that sort of diminish his divinity? The argument is called the impassibility versus the passibility of God. Impassibilists believe that God is not moved by what moves us, because if so, that would make him less godlike. Passibilists believe that God does in fact feel what we feel, suffers with us, and that's the beauty of God. I believe, as you can probably tell, that God is passible, that God is able to in some way feel what we feel, not as a passive victim, but as a willing participant. But again, not every theologian would agree with that. What most theologians would agree on, however, is that Jesus came to show us what God is like. And clearly, Jesus was moved by what moves others. He felt empathy, often translated compassion, from the Greek word splagnidzomai. Go ahead and say that out loud, splagnidzomai. Now you know the Greek word for compassion. Splagnidzomai is a deep in the bowels of the body ache that Jesus felt because of someone else's situation, so that he was moved to act on their behalf. So he would see their need, feel that pain in his bowels because of their situation, and then act with empathy on their behalf. He was always doing this. Jesus saw the man with leprosy, felt empathy, acted by touching the man and healing him, saw the crowd, filled with compassion, fed them. In Hebrews, which is a letter really all about the empathy of God, empathy of Christ, that great verse, Hebrews 4:15, is really the key to understanding the whole book of Hebrews. We do not have a high priest who is unable to empathize with our weaknesses. So then, if we are made in the image of God, and we are biologically wired for empathy, and if Jesus is the image of the invisible God and he is the epitome of empathy, then it stands to reason that the eternal God of the universe is empathic too. That's God's nature, empathy. Empathy is at the core of creation. It launches the biblical story. I mean, in the garden, humans were able to empathize with God, with each other, with the rest of creation. That was Genesis 1 and 2. In Genesis 3, our empathic capacity is diminished by sin. Since then, we have a tendency to ignore, demonize, blame, shame, lie, steal, exploit, and kill instead of empathize. But when through faith in Christ, the Spirit resides in us, God begins the work of restoring the imago Dei in us, rewiring our brain back to its original Edenic, empathic capacity so that we can be made perfect in love. Now, some theological traditions seem to believe that this restoration of the image of God happens later in heaven, there and then, not here and now. It's called glorification. But my Wesleyan tradition induces my optimism in the power of God's grace through the church, by the Spirit, to restore my empathic capacity here and now so that I connect with and love people not like me or who I don't like. We call this sanctification. So neurology confirms our holiness theology, not only because of mirror neurons, which would seem to assert that we are created in the image of an empathic God. We are at root empathic, not narcissistic, but for centuries, here's another recent find. fairly recent. For centuries, scientists believe that the brain is pretty fixed at the point of adolescence. The brain cement is dry by the time one reaches adulthood, so they thought. But over the past few decades, scientists have debunked that historic assumption to assert that the brain is plastic, actually, long into adulthood. In other words, it's possible that our adult brain can be physically rewired, restored, renewed, that by the Holy Spirit, through the process of sanctification, an angry, apathetic brain can be transformed into an empathetic brain. If Robin from Batman were here, he would say, "Holy neuropneumatology, Batman." Okay, so what does all this neurology and theology have to do with ministry to people not like us or we don't like? Everything, actually. Effective ministry to people not like you, who you don't like, is a process really of seeing, imagining, empathizing, and acting. That seems to be God's ministry grid. It's how God does ministry. It starts with seeing, really seeing the other. One of my favorite stories in the Old Testament is in Genesis 16. Abraham and Sarah can't get pregnant. So Abraham sleeps with Sarah's maidservant, an Egyptian slave girl, Hagar. She gets pregnant. Sarah, who can't get pregnant, becomes jealous of Hagar and makes life miserable for her. Hagar has had enough. She takes off. She goes to the desert. There she is, a pregnant woman alone. And God shows up, and God sees her. Genesis 16:13 says, she gave this name to the Lord who spoke to her. "You are the God who sees me." For she said, "I have now seen the one who sees me." God was able to see and imagine his way into Hagar's sandals so that he empathizes with her and acts on her behalf. Jesus, of course, is the incarnation of the invisible God, and he's quite empathic too. In Mark 10, a rich young man comes to Jesus and says, "Teacher, what must I do to be saved?" Jesus says, "Obey the commandments." The rich young man says, "All these I have kept since I was a boy." And Mark 10:21 says, Jesus looked at him, saw him, looked at him, and loved him. "One thing you lack," he said. "Go and sell everything you have and give it to the poor, and you will have treasure in heaven. Then come, follow me." This man is rich. Jesus is poor. This man is self-righteous. Jesus was humble. Yet Jesus found the capacity, the grace to empathize with someone not like him. And Jesus' immediate response to this rich, righteous, smug dude is not disgust, but love. He looked at him and loved him. Jesus saw the crowd, had compassion. Jesus saw the leper, had compassion. There's something about seeing, really seeing the other person, that is godlike. Perhaps this is why Jesus said in the Sermon on the Mount, "The eye is the lamp of the body." Perhaps this is why one of the most frequent indictments from God about his people is they have eyes to see, but do not see. So ministry starts with seeing, hearing, listening, observing, attending. Jesus looked at him. And then it moves from seeing to imagining. God has given our brain this imaginative capacity to bridge the gap of distance between us and someone not like us. Imagination fills the gap so that we can begin to think and feel from the perspective of another person or group. It's a God-given capacity. Jesus imagines what it's like to be the rich young man. He sees past the money, past the honor, and he sees the emptiness in the man that few in that culture would have seen, because the guy seems to have everything. He's rich and religious. What else could he want? But he still lacks something, and Jesus was able to see and imagine his way into that person's situation and empathize with him, because the natural result of really seeing someone and imagining what it's like to be them is empathy. And then once you feel empathy, you act on their behalf, because it will nag at you until you do. And I want you to notice here that Jesus' empathy was the impetus for him calling out the lack in the man. So empathy is not endorsement necessarily. Jesus didn't say to the rich man, out of empathy, go on your way and continue to allow your love of wealth to be a ball and chain around you. Now, Jesus called out the man's lack. He looked, loved, and then called out the lack. So before we can talk about becoming an empathic minister, let's talk about how to become an empathic person. Because you got to be an empathic person to be an empathic pastor. If you've been in ministry more than a week, you have run into someone you don't like or who doesn't like you. I remember a senior in one of the churches I served who didn't like me, and so I returned the favor. Our differences were significant. They were generational, regional, geographical, educational, and ecclesiological. We thought very differently about the church. I was 31, he was 71 or so. And I remember I tried not to see him because it hurt. So when I was preaching, I wouldn't make eye contact with him. When I saw him in the foyer, I would smile, but not really look in his eyes. I didn't want to see him. I wanted to pastor him from a safe distance because I was hurt. And my wife, who is extremely empathic, encouraged me to go to lunch with him, and I did. And I sat across the table from him, and I looked at him, saw him, and I loved him. And I asked him questions. I got to see the world a bit from the perspective of his story. And if you're a Christian minister, you have to see people to see what they see so that you can serve them well. So I really want to talk about seeing practices, how to see people. Now, before we start adopting practices, we're going to have to overcome some habits and proclivities. Again, most of us are tempted to think mostly of ourselves most of the time. I know I am. And it's hard to see people in ways that cultivate empathy when our nose is in the cell phone, or our eyes are glued to the computer or the TV screen, or we're anxious about tomorrow or regretful about yesterday. Self-absorption inhibits empathy, I've found. It limits our capacity to see and understand people not like us or we don't like. The key, I think, is learning to see people with the empathic, observant, probing eyes of Christ. So let's talk about some brass tacks here, some practical ways to develop a habit of seeing people. My book, Preaching with Empathy, has a bunch of suggested practices that have the potential to rewire, restore us back to our Edenic capacity for empathy. But here are just two ways to see past the nose on my face to the hearts and minds of others. First, try a Walmart walk. I hate Walmart and I hate shopping, which is why this practice is so formative for me, because I hate it. Here's what I encourage you to do. Walk up and down every aisle in Walmart. Not shopping, just looking into the eyes, into the faces of people who are coming at you. This is a little bit difficult to do with masks on these days, but as you're looking at people and trying to imagine what it's like to be them, to really see them, intercede for them in prayer as God's Spirit leads you. It's a wonderful practice that can really help you develop the capacity to see people. The second practice is to engage social media as a spiritual discipline. Now we know that social media can be deformational. It can cultivate jealousy and judgment more than empathy, but it can also be formational. So engage Facebook, Instagram, Twitter like this. As you're scrolling through Facebook, let's say, try to see the post behind the post. Why did that person post that? How does that person see the world? And then intercede for that person. The second thing is to celebrate. The Bible says rejoice with those who rejoice, right? So when somebody's celebrating something on social media, like it, share it. Congratulations, that's awesome. You're the best. You're so skilled at that. You have a beautiful home. Your kids are so cute, whatever. Rejoice with someone who's rejoicing. Empathize with them as if their joy is your joy. That's a great way to cultivate empathy. And then not only does the Bible say rejoice with those who rejoice, it also says weep with those who weep. So through social media, be an advocate for those who weep. Be a voice for the voiceless. Share something for someone who's ostracized or marginalized. Make a post that would help us to see people we often overlook. Intercede, celebrate, advocate. Or simply trying to develop the capacity to see people. Not long ago, I was at a restaurant with a friend, and I was thinking a lot about empathy, or I would have missed this opportunity, trust me. But I noticed our waitress. I've been going to this restaurant for 10 years, and she just seemed down. I don't know her that well. But after leaving a nice tip, I went over and I said to her, this may seem a little weird to you. I don't do this all the time, but I just really feel like I needed to tell you something. Is it okay if I? And she said, yeah. I said, I just feel compelled by God, I think, to tell you that you are the apple of God's eye, that he loves you with an everlasting, unconditional love. I don't know if you needed to hear that. And she started to cry, and she said, I definitely needed to hear that. I'm going through a nasty divorce right now. Thank you. She's a small town girl living in a lonely world. I'm a city boy born and raised in South Philly. Sounds like a Journey song. She's very different from me, but I was able to see her on that day, and I'm so glad I did. I think it meant a lot to her. Practices eventually become habits that transform our brain wiring. This is why spiritual disciplines are so crucial. I recently read an article that asserted that 7 people who had a bunch of people, it was a small group, I forget how large the group was, but they had a 7-day spiritual retreat in which they engaged in practices of prayer and spiritual formation. And every single one of them in that 7-day retreat experienced from before to after significant physiological changes in the basal ganglia area of their brain in just 7 days of participating in those practices. All that to say, practices matter. So let's talk about, we can't talk about every facet of ministry, preaching and leading and caring. So we'll just talk about preaching, if that's okay with you. Becoming an empathic preacher. How to see and imagine, empathize, and act through the 4 phases of the homiletic process. And what are those phases? As far as I can tell, exegesis of the biblical text, intercession for the congregational context, construction of the sermon that intimately intertwines faithful exegesis and fitting intercession, and then delivery that empathizes with God, with the people to whom you preach, and with the biblical text. So let's just run through a few practices for becoming an empathic preacher. Let's talk about exegesis. Deborah Hunsinger writes, the skills involved in listening to another with empathy are remarkably similar to those required in carefully reading a text. So empathic biblical exegesis requires a hospitable openness to going where the text wants to go, not where you want to take it. Empathic exegesis is a lot like having a considerate conversation with a friend. We try to resist the urge to say what's on our mind in order to really fully attend to what our friend is saying. That's how to read scripture, in my estimation. So here are some ways to do empathic exegesis. Empathize with the villain. Empathize not just with the hero of the story, but the villain of the narrative, right? Just don't just consider the perspective of the young stone-slinging David, but the viewpoint of the sword-wielding Goliath or the power-hungry King Saul. When interpreting the struggle between Jesus and the scribes, take on the perspective of those legalistic lawyers. Stretch your empathic muscles by empathizing with the villain. Preach from the perspective of Judas, not just Peter, from the perspective of the Pharisees, from Herod, from Pilate. You get the idea. It actually will help you preach an old familiar text in a new and fresh way. And then the second thing is converse with diverse interpreters. This is huge. When it comes to the biblical scholars you consult, don't just consult men, consult women. Not just white, but black and yellow and brown theologians. Not just those with a Western perspective, but those with an Eastern perspective. Not just someone who's old, but someone who's young. Not just someone who's Wesleyan, but maybe even a Calvinist or a Catholic. That will stretch your empathic muscles. And then I would say, grab a cross-section of people in your congregation. Let your people help you preach better. Get 5 to 7 people, young and old, new believer, seasoned saint, rich, poor, black, white, brown, yellow, and read the text you're going to preach the coming Sunday with them. I did this when I was lead pastor of a local church, and I would read with my staff the text I was going to preach. And we had a diverse staff, and they would raise questions I didn't raise and offer insights I didn't see. And that time shaped what I preached that coming Sunday. All this to say, empathetic exegesis is done best in community. Let's talk about intercession. Intercede like Christ, right? So prayerfully imagine how the biblical exegesis will be incarnated in the hopes and hurts of the particular people to whom you preach. Once you have an idea of what the word of the Lord is, the sermon for the coming Sunday, say the sermon in a nutshell is the main idea, the big point, whatever you want to call it, is Jesus loves the lonely. Go through your directory. Pray for 10 to 15 families each week. Pray the sermon into their lives. How will Joanne, this single mom with 3 kids who's barely scraping by, how will she hear that message? How will John, who's been recently widowed at the age of 55, how will he hear the message about Jesus loving the lonely? How will Maddie, a shy and bullied 16-year-old, how will she hear the message? So just pray the sermon through your church directory. And then take a prayer walk. Go around the church campus and see the space where your people connect with God, and imagine what it's like to be them, and pray. And then I would say, not only on your church campus, I'd say go around your community, do a prayer walk, and try to identify needs of people in your community and how the coming sermon will intersect your community needs. And then there's construction. The preacher, I think of the preacher as a courier who passes love notes between 2 long-lost lovers, between God and humanity. And so the preacher is a prophet who represents the will and the way of God to the congregation. But the preacher is also a priest who brings the hopes and the hurts of the people to God. So we're exchanging love notes from God to people as a prophet, but also from people to God as a priest. Now, most of us have been taught to preach in ways that are theological, representing God as a prophet. But I think we've missed out on the anthropological preaching, where we use our words to represent people to God. All this to say that when we preach, people should sense both this preacher walks with God and knows God, but this preacher also knows me. So how do we ground biblical exegesis, kingdom reality, into the real lives of the real people to whom we preach? Here are 3 tools for doing that. Contemplate context. So once you have a sense of the biblical exegesis, engage it personally. How does this text confront, convict, correct, comfort me personally? And then move on to the church. How does this text intersect with what's going on in the life of my church, in the life of my community around the church? How does this text confront or comfort the nation or the world? Some of us do this intuitively, but I think it's important to do it intentionally. Out of this will grow a sermon that is grounded in relevant ways today. Your illustrations will come out of this, your applications will come out of this contemplation of context. Because again, we're not just after biblical substance. That's a Bible study. We're after contextual relevance too. The bridging of biblical substance with contextual relevance, that's what makes the sermon a sermon. Another practice for constructing an empathic sermon is to identify needs, as I kind of alluded to in the intercession piece, but Maslow's hierarchy of needs is really helpful here. Try to imagine, what are the needs, human needs, that will be addressed by the coming sermon. And Jesus met every category of needs in Maslow's hierarchy. And so what are the needs that your sermon this Sunday will address? Think about that and imagine that and pray accordingly. And then concretize concepts. Jacoboni, one of those neuroscientists I mentioned earlier, says that tactile concrete language referring to a body part actually triggers mirror neurons in the brains of listeners as if they were doing the action. So when you say Adam took a bite of the apple, the listeners' mirror neurons fire as if they were actually biting an apple as well. What does this have to do with preaching? I think preaching that employs active, tactile, concrete language helps listeners empathically connect with the biblical text way more than conceptual preaching does. Conceptual preaching allows for objective distance. Concrete preaching creates more intimacy. And Jesus preached in a way that concretized concepts. How did he concretize the concept of the kingdom? Well, it's like a sower who went out to sow seed. The concept of the kingdom is like a fishing net that was cast into the sea. A concept like faith is concretized with a mustard seed. You can say Adam sinned, or you could say Adam bit the apple. You can say Adam won, boring, or Adam slung the stone in Goliath's brain. You can say unforgiveness is a problem, or you can say bitterness is like drinking poison expecting the other person to die. Concretize concepts. Empathic sermons require enfleshed language about an enfleshed God. That's what a good sermon does. Last part, I just want to talk about delivery for just a minute. Empathic delivery, so important. See them, see you. I don't know if this has ever happened to you, but I don't know if you've ever been in a conversation with two other people where the person talking was looking at your friend the whole time and never looking at you, right? The person talking never made eye contact with you, and so you felt like your presence wasn't all that important, and certainly there wasn't an empathic bond created with the person speaking. Well, the people we preach to sometimes feel the same, right? If the preacher is more into paper than people, people won't feel that empathic bond. If the preacher is more concerned with intentionally communicating content than intimately, relationally connecting with people, there's going to be a problem. Let's go back to mirror neurons. Remember that I said mirror neurons in the brain fire when we observe people, when we see them. So the preacher who is in the moment with the people to whom he or she preaches, observing their eyes, their face, their body, because the people are preaching a message back to us with their eyes while we're preaching to them. And if we're with them in the moment, seeing them see us, we're actually adjusting what we're saying and how we're saying it in the moment we're saying it. This is huge. Eye contact is not just about being rhetorically eloquent, but relationally empathic. Sermon delivery is not just about the preacher being seen and understood by listeners, but about the listeners being seen and understood by the preacher while the preacher preaches. It's so important, which is why I encourage my students to adopt the 25% rule. Devote 25% of your overall sermon preparation time to preparing for delivery, internalizing, practicing, memorizing. Write out a manuscript and take notes with you. I don't care, but make sure that when you preach, you are with people, seeing them see you. This will revolutionize the preaching of some preachers, because you'll be able to notice if they're disengaged and adjust, or if they're angry and adjust, if they're confused and adjust. This advice is as old as Augustine from the 4th century. Augustine, in his book On Christian Doctrine, the 4th book, which he wrote for preachers and teachers, talked about how it's important to see them while they see you preach. He said, if while you're preaching, you see someone open their mouth, not to express approval, but to yawn, quickly tell a joke, re-engage them, adjust what you're saying and how you're saying it based upon the cues they're giving you. Now, today, this is so tough. Like right now, video communication is so challenging for me because all I see is my face, and that's not fun. And I can't adjust what I'm saying and how I'm saying it based upon your cues. And of course, with mask wearing as it is these days in churches, and I'm all for it to keep people safe, of course, but man, it's near impossible to see them see you while you're preaching if they're wearing masks. It's so difficult to form an empathic bond. Preaching's tough today. It's going to pass, but it's tough right now. Bottom line at the end here, if you want empathic kids, be an empathic parent. If you want an empathic congregation, be an empathic pastor. If the church is going to have any hope in bridging the political, racial, generational, and other cultural divides, ministers must develop the grace to empathize with people not like us or who we don't like. We need the empathy of Paul, who preached very differently to Athenian Greeks in the town square than he did to diaspora Jews in the synagogue. He adjusted what he said based upon their particular needs. We need the empathy of the Apostle Paul, who said, to the Jews, I became a Jew. To the Greek, I became a Greek. To the weak, I became weak. I've become all things to all people, that I might by all means save some. That's empathy. Empathy is the spiritual grace that God gives us to effectively minister to people not like us or who we don't like. Thanks for listening. Turn it over to Joel.
That was fantastic, Dr. Luchetti. Thank you so much. I'm telling you, we got Batman, we got Journey, we got Empathyometer. Love that.
Beastie Boys, don't forget the 80s.
And Beastie Boys, yeah, that. And then was it Splagmizmi?
Splagnidzmi.
Splagmizmi. I was close. That was fantastic. Thank you so much. Before we get started on our Q&A session here, I wanted to ask you, I know you have a class that's upcoming here in January. If I were current seminary student or not a seminary student yet and I was interested, do I still have time to get into your class?
Yeah, you can probably best to register and then email me, and I'll send you the syllabus, and there's some pre-course reading and writing.
Okay. And what is the class? Is it on Preaching with Empathy? Is that correct?
Preaching with Empathy, and it's offered via Zoom, so you can stay in your home while you take it.
Love it. Awesome. Yeah, email us or email me. We'll get you pointed in the right direction if you're interested in that. Okay, we have some questions coming in here if you're ready. Oh, wow. This is a good one. Wow. How do we love on people when they are constantly critical and hurtful towards you and they are a board member? Thank God I am not in this situation now, but have been in the past.
Well, it's a great question, and it's a hard practice to embody in terms of empathetic love for someone you don't like and someone who makes your life miserable because they don't like you. I've been in that position several times, and my knee-jerk response is to, again, as I mentioned, avoid people. But almost every time, now again, this person might be entirely belligerent, and there's a time to sort of not be a doormat for people and just sort of perhaps cut people off, not cut them off, but diminish their influence because they're getting in the way of what God wants to do. But almost every time I've been in that kind of position, when I've been tempted to sort of run and hide, but found the grace to move toward the person. Because from a distance you can demonize a person, but to go to lunch, go get some coffee, and just get to know the person. What's your testimony? How did you come to faith in Christ? What do you love about the church? How do you see your role as a board member? How can I serve you as your pastor? I mean, it doesn't fix everything. It may sound simplistic, but it gives me the capacity to see the world, at least for a little bit, from their perspective. And that helps.
Very good. Excellent. I love your line earlier. I mean, just so powerful. So much great stuff. All right, I've got another question here. Some people are naturally empathetic. They're born that way. Others have to learn empathy as a discipline. What is the one thing you suggest someone can do to develop the skill of empathy? I love your idea of the Walmart walk. That was a great idea.
Yeah, a couple other ideas. The Walmart walk's great. I'd say too, watch movies or read books from the perspective of people not like you or who you don't like. So if you're a Republican, is going to scare some people. If you're a Republican, read Hillary Clinton's biography. If you're a Democrat, read on Trump or Bush. I've been trying to read books with the lead character being a female. It's been helpful for me to imagine from another gender. And so that's real helpful. I think just to spend time with reading and viewing, spend time in conversation with people who are different from you. I talk about the Breakfast Club. I triple dog dare some of you to grab 4 people who are very different from you and from each other in your church and go out to breakfast once a month, your own little breakfast club, and have a conversation menu where you ask questions that are like hot button questions. Like, what do you think of Trump? What do you think of social injustice? What do you think about immigration? I mean, just ask any kind of question you can think of that you shouldn't ask, and get these very diverse people talking and listening to each other. It's really risky, but man, it can be so illuminating and so refreshing.
Great idea. All right, next question. Do you have an example when Jesus' disciples failed to be empathetic? Do you have an example when Jesus' disciples failed to be empathetic?
Oh, there's so many. Well, for one, I think about the time when the disciples found out that some other disciples, not them, were doing some ministry. And I think the disciples wanted to call down fire from heaven, right, to devour them. And Jesus, they weren't empathizing with a different group of disciples in that case, and were jealous, really. Jealousy inhibits empathy. Judgment inhibits empathy. Them curious about why Jesus was talking to the Samaritan woman, and because that was taboo for a man to speak to a woman in that culture. I think they had a really hard time empathizing with Jesus, actually. In Mark chapter 10, one of the funniest chapters in the Bible, if it weren't so sad, Jesus just told the disciples, I'm going to Jerusalem to suffer and die. That's my role as the Messiah, suffering and dying. And the next words out of James and John's mouth, at least how Mark arranges it, was, Lord, when you come into your kingdom, grant that one of us sit on your right and one of us sit on your left. We want power and privilege positions in your kingdom, after Jesus just said he's going to suffer and die. So empathy was not their strong suit at that point. Now, Peter gets it in Acts. This Peter, who's a racist Jew in the book of Acts, chapter 10, is standing in the home of Cornelius, a Gentile, and says, I now perceive how true it is that God doesn't show partiality, but accepts all people from all nations who fear him and do what's right. Wow, he got it. Took a while.
Wow. Good stuff. Thank you. Okay, this is a good one. Do you have any advice for ministering to people who are different from you in regards to things you may feel are important kingdom values? For example, I know of white pastors who were name-called and attacked by other Christians for standing up against racial injustice or for standing in solidarity with our Black brothers and sisters? How do you minister to people who are different and out of tune with the kingdom? Sometimes the differences are just differences. Sometimes they seem to be divides. And as a pastor, it often feels like I need to draw a line in the sand and stand in accordance with my own convictions. Wow.
Yeah, to me, the easiest differences to overcome are racial, economic. I think growing up in the city, I was exposed to a lot of economic and ethnic diversity. So those external kinds of differences are not a big age difference is not a big deal to me. What is harder to overcome, as this person's question I think is getting at, are those deep-seated philosophical, theological, ecclesiological, like church differences. Those are tough. Yeah, so I found myself constantly trying to teach people, trying to sort of met out the differences between what I call American churchianity and biblical Christianity, which are very different at times from each other. I'm not anti-American at all, love America, but a lot of what we do in the American church is more American than it is biblical. So how do you get it? I think I'm answering the question. I hope I am. Mm-hmm. I think it's just a matter of, number one, embodying your convictions with grace and consistency. When you have a chance to teach and preach, to do so with gentleness and respect, but don't shy away from it. So I remember doing a series on the politics of Jesus, where I offended Republicans and Democrats. I think everybody hated me for a couple weeks, and that was okay, but it was in the context of teaching from a kingdom perspective. And so I think just embodying, teaching, listening first, then offering can be a helpful guide. But at the end of the day, there's people who are going to disagree with you and not like you because of the stands you take that are more gospel conviction than political convention. And that's okay.
Well, this next question kind of feeds off of that, I think. I have strong leanings towards empathy. And so when I first was walking into my call, those leaders around me wanted to toughen me up for ministry. Why is it promoted and necessary to be tough and not to celebrate empathy as a ministry leading strength?
Great question. I don't know. I think some people are naturally better at truth telling. Pastors are truth tellers and see themselves that way as a prophetic truth teller. Some of us see ourselves more as a priestly grace giver. That comes easy for us. And what I'm after in ministerial development of myself and my students is trying to get us to have range. So that if our natural proclivity is priestly grace giving, then we need to learn also how to be a prophetic truth teller. And if we're more naturally a prophetic truth teller in our preaching and carrying and leading, then I want us to stretch more toward the priestly grace giving as well. So perhaps those people who are trying to invest in you were trying to stretch you so that you could be more of a prophetic truth teller, that you could be a little harder when you needed to be, have the courage, because you already have the compassion of a priestly grace giver, but you're going to have the courage of a prophetic truth teller to make the hard call in ministry too. The problem is when we just decide on one or the other, I think. Oh, I'm just a prophet. I just tell the whole truth, nothing but the truth, so help me God. I don't care about people. And then there's the other side, which is I care so deeply about the feelings of people that I sometimes don't tell them the truth that might hurt, but they need. And I think you just need both. Jesus, John 1:14, Jesus came from the Father full of grace and truth. Grace without truth is no grace at all. Truth without grace is no truth at all. We need both.
Wow, good stuff. Thank you. Are you up for a few more questions?
Yeah, let's do, what do we have? Yeah, let's do a couple more.
Okay. All right, let's see. All right, now this is not who you may think it's from, but how can you empathize with an elder who is a Dallas Cowboy fan? Kind of kidding, but a real question is, how do you deal with this on a congregational level other than prayer and living it out?
think my buddy Aaron, who's a diehard Eagles fan, probably asked that question. I don't know.
It's from Aaron, but not Dr. Aaron Perry.
Errenin. Yeah,
Right.
I know who it is.
Okay.
I don't know if he's serious or not, but yeah, like Cowboys fans are tough. I'm with Stephen A. Smith on that. Cowboys fans are tough to love.
Pre-Jerry Jones, we're a lot better. We're a lot
Yeah,
easier.
I don't think I have a good answer for that question, so let's go to the next one.
Okay. Besides you, Dr. Luchetti, who are the contemporaries that you look up to exemplify empathetic and biblical-based preaching? In terms of secular folks, who would you consider speaks with empathy and connects well with their intended audience? Kind of two-part there. Who are the contemporaries
Oh,
you
man.
look up to for empathetic and biblical-based preaching?
Yeah, I don't know. I'm trying to think of contemporary. I say most preachers I hear, and even the preacher where the church I attend, if I find myself thinking, wow, this preacher knows me, this preacher gets me, this preacher has just articulated with words hopes and hurts that I have that I myself cannot articulate, and they just put it into words for me. That's when I say, oh, that preacher has some empathy. They've interceded for me. They've thought long and hard about the human condition, what it's like to be me. So I find that among a lot of preachers, actually. Not consistently, maybe, but once in a while. The preachers I look at in terms of exemplars of empathy are like John Wesley, Martin Luther King. Martin Luther King, he's a great study. If you read his speeches, he had a way of empathizing with white people and try to get them to empathize with the black community. And he had a way when he was with the black community of trying to get them to empathize with moderate whites. So if you just read how he preached, it was never us and them. It was always us, we. And I think to watch your pronouns, I watch the preacher's pronouns a lot. So this is nitpicky perhaps, but if the preacher is constantly using one gender in his or her language, that's to me a lack of empathy. If the preacher is always indicting the congregation, you must, you ought, you have, and never self-indicting like we, us, I kind of check out. So watch your pronouns when you preach.
Very good. All right, last question. One more here. Okay, what are some common practices you find in our culture that are counter to building empathy that may seem innocent or allowable, but can be deadly to our empathy building? Some common practices that you find in our culture that are counter to building empathy that may seem innocent or allowable, but can be deadly to our empathy building.
Yeah, I think I got at this a few times in my in what I shared in my content, that we tend to gravitate to people who think like we think, or look like we look, or feel like we feel, and that's a mistake. So we tend to watch news mediums with which we already agree, who will only preach what we already believe. So if you're a Fox watcher, watch CNN sometimes. If you're a CNN watcher, watch Fox. I'll go back and forth between the two on the same story, and it's amazing how they see them differently. It's kind of funny, actually. And then spend time with people. I think this is so key. Just spend time with people who are not like you or don't think like you. The hardest person for me to relate to is, because I didn't come from a Christian background, I wasn't raised in a Christian home. So the people I have had the hardest time with in ministry are people I perceive to be longtime churchgoers who never knew what it was like to be lost without Christ, and who seem to be like the older brother in the parable of the prodigal, trying to keep younger sons from coming back to the Father. And so I've had to intentionally work at moving toward them and spending time with them so I can see the world from their perspective. And I found they cared about lost people like I do, but just went at it in different ways.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. I appreciate that. That'll wrap up our Q&A session for today. So I want to give some thank yous, first of all, to Wesley Seminary for sponsoring today's event. Secondly, to Dr. Luchetti for an incredible presentation, your time answering those questions. Thank you so much. And the time to prepare this presentation as well. And lastly, to you, people that are watching, we're doing these for you. So thank you so much for your time and for your interest. In that same light, if you would, please take the time to fill out the survey that will pop up when you log off today. And today we have, I alluded to it earlier, 2 free giveaways, and they're both signed copies of Dr. Luchetti's books, Preaching with Empathy, Crafting Sermons in a Callous Culture, and Preaching Essentials, a Practical Guide. These are both signed copies, so we will give these away, and they'll be randomly picked from those who fill out their surveys. Would also ask anyone that is watching this during the recording as well. You can just email me if you would like, and we'll enter you into the drawing if you're not watching this live. Also, these books are available on Amazon. Is that correct, Dr. Luchetti? You can find these on Amazon. So if you don't win one, go to Amazon. You can get both, and also look for his upcoming book coming out this spring. So I think that'll conclude today's time. If you are curious about seminary, if you're on the fence, or you're just feeling led to seminary, or you just have a question, just give us a call, 877-673-0009, or email us at wesley@endwest.edu. We'd love to answer any questions that you might have. No questions are too big, too small. Love to chat with you and get your questions answered. So thank you for joining us today. Have a great rest of your day. Blessings. Merry Christmas. And remember, we are Wesley and you belong here. Thank you so much. Have a great rest of your day. Bye-bye.